All right, in this short lecture today, we're going to talk about Thomas Robert Malthus and limits to growth. This lecture kind of serves as a bridge between our discussion of exponential growth and the power of exponential growth. And we're going to start more and more thinking about limits to growth and why populations can't grow on exponentially forever. That is a ridiculous thought when we start to think about what might happen if populations were allowed to grow for many, many generations at their exponential growth rate. And we start to get into crazy numbers, as we saw with the puffball example. So populations can't grow exponentially forever. There are limits to growth, and one of the first people to realize that that was the case was Thomas Malthus. Now, Malthus, and you can read more about him, he's a very interesting character. You can read about him on the Wikipedia page. If you go to our lecture, you can see that we're on the Malthus lecture here, and there's a link to the Wikipedia page if you want to know more. Very influential thinker. He was a cleric and also a economist. And he penned, and this is what we're going to talk about today, he wrote one of the most important and influential essays ever written. I think you can really fairly clearly make that claim. And the essay was called An Essay on the Principle of Population, and it had a lot to do with population growth, exponential growth, and limits to exponential growth. So here's a picture of Mr. Malthus, and the main point of his essay can be summed up with the following quote, and this is directly from his essay. The power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. So what is he saying? The power of population, exponential growth, is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. That is the ability of the earth to produce food for supporting human populations. So that is the essence of his argument. Let's just go through it in a slightly more wordy manner, and hopefully you'll get a little bit of a deeper glimpse into his thinking here. This is Malthus again. I think I may make fairly two postulata. First, that food is necessary to the existence of man. Secondly, that the passion between the sexes is necessary and will remain nearly in its present state. Assuming then my postulata as granted, I say that the power of population is indefinitely greater than the power in the earth to produce subsistence for man. Population, when unchecked, increases in a geometrical ratio. We'll talk about that in a second. Subsistence increases only in an arithmetical ratio. A slight acquaintance with numbers will show you the immensity of the first power in comparison of the second. By the law of our nature, which makes food necessary to the life of man, the effects of these two unequal powers must be kept equal. This implies a strong and constantly operating check on population from the difficulty of subsistence. This difficulty must fall somewhere and must necessarily be severely felt by a large portion of mankind. So take a minute to make sure you understand what he's saying here. This is written in a slightly older version of the English language, and you may not completely follow everything here. Let's first talk just a little bit about what he means by the power of population, and when he uses the term geometrical ratio versus arithmetical ratio. All he means here is that population size, when we simulate population size growing over time, remember we use lambda as our multiplier for population, and every time we increment to the next year, we have to multiply the population size in the previous time step by lambda. That multiplication process over time that causes exponential growth is also called geometric growth. All right. So if you didn't already know that, that's a mathematical term to describe exponential growth or multiplicative growth. And so what he's saying here is that populations can grow exponentially, but food resources tend to increase only in a arithmetical ratio, meaning it's additive, that we can't really do much more than produce just a certain amount more food every year, and that amount doesn't change over time. It doesn't depend on the previous time. You just add a certain amount. Basically, what he's saying is linear growth over time, that no matter how big the existing human food resource is, it's only going to be able to grow by a certain quantity every year that doesn't grow exponentially. So it's not as powerful. That kind of growth, that linear growth, is not as powerful as exponential growth. And that is what he's saying. A slight acquaintance with numbers will show the immensity of the first power, geometric or multiplicative or exponential growth, in comparison of the second, linear or arithmetical growth. All right. And so, and Thomas Malthus was an economist as well, and he had an economic argument that essentially follows these lines here. So his economic argument: there are always hard limits to human population growth, and these limits have to do with food availability. All right. So no matter what, there's always going to be some limit to population growth, and we're going to, because the power of exponential growth is so incredibly powerful, then these limits, we will reach them at some point. All right. And they're always there. When there is more food available, that is, if we're able to increase agricultural production or increase food availability in some way, humans will tend to use that extra energy, that food energy, towards reproduction, all right, instead of improving quality of life, essentially, is what he's saying. And that is only going to temporarily forestall a crisis. That is, the exponential growth is so powerful that we will inevitably reach the new limit to growth. That is, we're going to reach the limit of food availability, and that will lead to widespread famine, disease, etc., especially among poor and disadvantaged populations. And that was his essential message. All right. Now, is this an optimistic message or a pessimistic message? The answer to that is obvious. I do not need you to respond to that one in Top Hat, because I know that we will all kind of think of this as a pessimistic message. Basically, he's saying that war and famine and disease are inevitable because we will reach the limits to growth. Human populations will exceed the power of the earth to sustain these populations, and there will be misery. So that is what Thomas Malthus was saying. But I do want you to pause and answer or address a different question. And this is a totally open-ended discussion question, but please go into Top Hat now and just give your take. Again, there's no wrong answers here, but I'd like your take on this question. Was Malthus right? Was he right for humans? And was he right when it comes to wild populations? And can you think of any examples to back up your claims? And so hopefully that'll be an interesting discussion, and I look forward to reading your responses. All right. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that this essay, an essay on population, essay on the principle of population that Thomas Malthus wrote, that essay was one of the most important and influential essays ever written. And that brings me to this man here, who you probably recognize. This man, as you know, is Charles Darwin. Now, Charles Darwin, interestingly, in 1838, which is 4 years after Malthus's death, Charles Darwin, just back from his trip on the Beagle, that was from 1831 to 1836, and obviously you know the implications of his trip on the HMS Beagle, Charles Darwin was searching for possible mechanisms to explain the origin of species, and he came across Malthus's essay on the principle of population. And Darwin, upon reading that, realized one of the possible implications of the checks that controlled population growth, that is, the power of exponential growth, means that when you start to reach the limit to growth, many individuals will be born that won't be able to survive to adulthood due to resource limitations. So there's going to be a massive number of individuals that can just not make it to reproductive age and contribute to the next generation. And he wrote that favorable variations, that is, individuals with with phenotypes or adaptations that might lend themselves increased survival rate or survival probability would tend to be preserved, and unfavorable variations would tend to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. Here then, I had at last got a theory by which to work. Charles Darwin. All right. So 21 years later, Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. I think there's a actually longer name than that, but that's basically the title of his book. Like Malthus's work, it too, Charles Darwin's work, as you know, raised a storm of controversy and protest, but obviously changed the course of scientific thought. So what do you think? Was Malthus's essay influential? Yes, it was extremely influential, and it continues to be debated to this day. So it is interesting to think about, and I look forward to reading more about what you think about whether he was right and in what ways he was right. All right? In the next video, we're going to go through an insight maker activity that makes Thomas Malthus's points hopefully even more clear, and we're going to talk a little bit more about limits to growth. All right, I'll see you then.